Hello, everyone, and welcome. We're thrilled that you are here today for this important Super Tuesday discussion. We have two really fantastic global communication experts with us today who will be taking us through the ins and outs of the 2016 presidential campaign, particularly Super Tuesday today, as well as thinking about how our elections compare internationally. So I want to introduce two of our panelists today and letting you all know that please feel invited at any time to, as we're going through kind of our questions and discussion, to ask questions of our panelists today. On my immediate left, your right, is Mr. Alexander Heffner. He is the host of PBS's The Open Mind, and his work has been featured in a number of media outlets, op-eds, articles in the New York Times and Reuters, as well as his work has been on C-SPAN, CNN. We are thrilled to have him here with us today. On Mr. Heffner's left, your right, is Mr. Joseph Daniel. Mr. Daniel has held a number of high-profile communication positions with the French national government, as well as a number of corporate communications positions with multinational corporations, including Total. And he is the author of a recent book, The Presidential Word, which looks at French presidential rhetoric. So once again, we are thrilled to have them here with us today. Can you please join me in giving them a round of applause?
Where's the translation?
And before we get started today, I'd also just like to briefly turn over the floor to one of our Lamb School faculty, Dr. Sarin Matei, for a quick thank you for today's event.
Well, I have to thank you, Josh, for hosting this wonderful forum. And I have to thank, in turn, first to the College of Liberal Arts, who awarded a global synergy grant to our school to bring Mr. Daniel here today. And most importantly, to Nick Crow, my colleague from Languages and Classics. They change these names all the time, from Classics, who made a contact with Mr. Daniel. Thank you so much all for coming today, and I hope you'll enjoy this wonderful forum.
Thank you, Dr. Matei. We'd also like to thank President Daniels' office as well for their support of this effort, particularly bringing Alexander Heffner to campus, the Department of Political Science, as well as the Brian Lamb School of Communication. We're doing really great things in terms of collaboration across the Lamb School and the Department of Political Science, and we're so thrilled to be able to bring this event to you today. So I want to begin with a brief overview of thinking about Super Tuesday for many of the students in the room. This is arguably the Super Bowl of the presidential nominating process today. There are 11 states across the United States, most of them in the South, voting for their party's nominees on the Democratic and Republican sides. So I want to begin with our guests today thinking about the presidential contest up until this point. And I want to begin with a broad question, and I'm going to start with Alexander here. And thinking about what would be the general perceptions of this election contest compared to, say, 2012 or 2008 when Barack Obama's on the ballot?
Well, it's great to be here. Thanks for all of you in poli-sci, journalism, whatever your discipline of choice is. I think you have a lot to learn from this presidential race, so hopefully this is informative. We said in 2008, and at the time I was reporting on the youth vote back then and have continued to chronicle it up to this point, we said that 2008 was historic, record-breaking, unprecedented in terms of who the Democratic nominee was, President Obama, then Senator Obama. And we judge a lot of our politics and a lot of our discourse is driven by celebrity, by narrative. And then we had a kind of Shakespearean twist in the form of a charismatic young freshman senator who was poised to break a glass ceiling, and that glass ceiling was the all-white, all-male presidency. Now looking towards 2016, ever since President Obama appointed Secretary Clinton and made her a part of his administration, there had been widespread speculation that the secretary would run. And adding to her resume of experience was her tenure at the State Department. So I think a lot of political analysts looked at that as the principal headline to explore. Would Secretary Clinton, formerly Senator Clinton, run? And ultimately, she made a decision to enter the race, and the media spotlight turned on her. And fast forwarding from 2008, we might get into what happened in 2012 too, but just fast forwarding quickly to 2016, we saw stories of scandal ensnare the early part of her primary campaign involving emails, classified information, and questions putting into doubt her authenticity, her integrity, maybe her honesty. And that was the narrative that we were following until Donald Trump announced that he was going to run. And the media spotlight and seemingly an endless megaphone has been at his disposal ever since he entered the race. And so the narrative turned from a focus on Secretary Clinton, another unprecedented campaign potentially leading to the first woman president this country has had, to a celebrity reality show. And whether you're from a Republican or Democratic disposition, whether you come at this from a conservative liberal bent, and a domestic or international bent, it's fair to observe that the spotlight has been entirely on Trump, and it's been focused on his rhetoric, his business acumen or lack thereof, and his overall profile and his ability to steer the media attention in a way that is most dominant. And so that really was the turn of the pendulum from what was going to be a focus squarely on Secretary Clinton's campaign to an outpouring of support for the Trump phenomenon. And it's partially a chicken and egg question. Was the overconsumption of the American media responsible for generating Trump victories, or is there the will in the American electorate to support a candidate who is of a Trump mold? And there are definitely different aspects to that mold. And briefly, I could say one aspect is celebrity. One aspect is the perception that he's a straight shooter, that he's blunt, that he's politically incorrect. And then the last aspect is the idea that it would take someone who is coming from outside of the traditional two-party establishment, but working within the Democratic or Republican Party to bring consensus back to Washington, D.C., and to resolve what has been the gridlock that we've seen among Democrats and Republicans in the Congress and throughout all branches of government. And so those are the three distinct areas of appeal. And today we'll have the opportunity later tonight to see if he is broken through entirely and is the juggernaut, the Republican coronation among voters. Now that's entirely different from whether there's a coronation among the delegates who actually are supposed to express the will of the Republican voters, because all these Republican primary voters are not the ones who are going to be at the convention. It's delegates who represent them. And there is the real possibility, even probability at this juncture, that if Donald Trump takes home all these contests, it is in great and grave opposition from leading traditional conservatives and Republicans who do not want a Trump candidacy and who do not want a Trump nomination. So I might leave it there as far as the snapshot of where we've come this cycle. There's a lot more to discuss in terms of the Sanders phenomenon and how the Republicans and Democrats are going to operate in the general election moving forward, but that's a little bit of a summary.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Joseph, I want you to play here in terms of thinking about your experience as a communications expert in the French government, and thinking about perceptions of American elections. Talk to us how a major world power outside the United States views what many consider the greatest American democracy in the world. So,
yes. Thank you. First, it's really a great privilege for me to be here to participate to this debate in such an important and exciting day. I want to thank Purdue University and Brian Lamb School of Communication for giving me this chance. They took two risks. The first risk, they choose to invite a Frenchman. And as you'll see, we are not in the same planet, even when we speak about things that seems to be the same affair, I mean presidential elections. And the second risk is that they choose a Frenchman from the prehistoric time. I mean before the national, social networks and the big data era. I'm not a person of this time, as you can imagine, but we'll see now if these two risks were absolutely unreasonable or not. How can we consider the American election and this one in particular? First, we pay a lot of interest to American elections, at least since the famous debate between Nixon and Kennedy in '61. We gave a hedge attention, a hedge interest to the endless debate between George W. Bush and Al Gore to know who had won. For us, it was impossible to understand that if someone had 500,000 more electors in the popular vote, he could be beaten, because you have a system of voting for delegates and not directly for the candidates. And I must say that more generally, your system of primaries and caucuses are for us a real headache. The fact that each state has its own rule, each one has its own calendar, it's hard to understand for a French who think that he is rational. We are not rational all the time, but for you, you are used to this system. For it had been implemented for a long time, and we are very new in the primary business, if I can say. The French Socialist Party introduced primaries in France in 2006. It was a closed primary just between the people of the Socialist Party. 5 years after, there have been a second experience, but it was open to what would we call people considering themselves as participating to the values of the left and giving, let's say, $3 for financing the operation. And the right wing criticized this system, but now they choose to adopt it. And they will implement it for the first time this year. But our two systems are quite different. Your system is a progressive system of elimination. You don't vote the same day, and you eliminate candidates after candidates. And so you can imagine that a candidate that could have been chosen by the majority of his camp in a race where everybody would be in the same run could be eliminated because he haven't enough money after having failed in 2 states, 3 states, 4 states. But these 2, 3, and 4 states are not necessarily representative of the whole country. We haven't a regional, a multi-state process of progressive elimination like yours. We have a national process of simultaneous selection. I mean, you have 2, 3, 4, 8 candidates. It depends. For the last socialist vote 5 years ago, it was 5 candidates. And in all the country, people vote the same day to choose. And so they don't know. They had debate. I'll say a word about the debates. They had debate before. They had opinion polls, but nobody is eliminated before the vote of everybody. And when these debates are quite different from yours. First, there are 3 TV debates, no more. Maybe this year there will be 4. And the few I have seen about your debates, it's the aggressivity, not only Trump's aggressivity, but even between Sanders and Clinton at the beginning, when he was repeating and repeating that she was a candidate of Wall Street, this wouldn't be acceptable in France, not because we are much more respectful than you are. Maybe we are much more hypocrite than you are. But we consider that usually the man attacking in a debate another person of the same wing may weaken himself more than he would weaken his adversary. They hate themselves, but they give an impression of respect. Mm-hmm. And now, of course, we are very debative to what's happening in this country. For the first time this week, an important French magazine, Le Point, had his cover with Trump. Who is this man? From which planet is he coming? How can we imagine that the main country, the main democratic country in the world, could be led by a man who had absolutely no political experience? He was only not even mayor of a small town. For us, it's hard to understand. I don't mean that he's not the good man for the good job. I don't know. But for us, it's quite hard to understand. And we had an influence of reality TV on our way of expressing for the political leaders and so on. But we didn't imagine that a reality TV mogul could be a credible candidate for presidency. Mm-hmm.
So I think that there's a lot that's come out of both of these initial introductions of the election process in the United States versus France. But I want to hone in on one particular topic that I know that we talked about with the students in campaigns and elections, and that's the issue of money in elections in terms of thinking about how campaigns are financed. And in a lot of ways, there is a lot of similar circumstances about the 2016 election that mirror prior elections in terms of many of the candidates raising money. But there's also, I think, some differences as well in terms of perhaps money not always equaling success. Mm-hmm. So I want to start, Alexander, in terms of thinking about money in elections.
Sure.
You had a candidate like Jeb Bush running on the Republican side. Mm-hmm. He and his super PAC raise a combine and spend about $130 million to get roughly 5% of the vote across 3 different contests. Mm-hmm. You then have a candidate like Donald Trump, who is, by all intents and purposes, raising a lot less money. By last count, he's raised $7 million from individual contributors and has loaned his campaign roughly $17 million of his own money, of which he can pay back before the primary process ends. So very different ways in terms of thinking about financing. How would you characterize the role of money in this election?
Well, I think that you have a more nuanced view than the way the media have captured this subject. And I would frame it a little differently, because Donald Trump represents oligarchy. How many of you are students of government? some of you probably taken a political science class, so you know the difference, hopefully, between oligarchy and democracy and aristocracy, or some of those lines that might be drawn. And it's fair to say we have a pseudo-oligarchy, if not a full-fledged oligarchy in a lot of senses. So I would factor in Trump's net worth, whatever it may be. He may not possess the billions that he claims, but he is a billionaire in his own right. And that, to me, would enable someone, especially someone who comes from the media world, having had a successful television show that millions of Americans watched, that gave him an edge that is capital. And so I think the media have dimmed this into some kind of false narrative that Jeb Bush only spent $200 million between his campaign and his super PAC, and therefore the force of money is negligible in politics. No, the force is overwhelming. And I think Senator Sanders has touched a nerve in this campaign. But it dates back to an unrequited promise of the Obama presidency, going all the way back to 2008, which is he made a pledge to participate in public finance. And because of his online grassroots apparatus and his ability, like Senator Sanders, to raise an incredible amount of money online from small donors, he ultimately forewent the public system. And subsequently, in a Supreme Court decision, Citizens United, the floodgates were opened as widely as one could possibly open them in emboldening the dissemination of money, so that whether you're a corporation or an individual, you can funnel money via campaign, via a PAC, into a political candidate, into a campaign, into some sort of political organization. So the role of money should be understood in our election system by the net worth of our candidates. And if you look at who is in the United States Senate, they're mostly people of great wealth. In the House of Representatives, much the same. And I don't think you can look at it purely in terms of how much a single candidate or his or her super PAC is raising. But to go back to Senator Sanders' proposition, his thesis, the revolution in politics, when he says he wants to rally young people around his movement of a political revolution, it is to end a rigged economy, just as much as it is to end a two-party monopoly on the political process. And I think the aspect of that is believable within Trump and his rhetoric, even though he is a billionaire, and what is believable among his blue-collar, middle-class supporters is the fact that he's not asking, even though, as you pointed out, he has a donate button on his website, he's not explicitly asking for money in the way the other candidates are. And that makes a difference insofar as he is saying that he is a merit-based candidate, self-funding him, and is going to bring an end to moneyed politics and moneyed political interests that are damaging our ability to realize or materialize political reform that is going to advance not one party's interests, but the entire experience of the American electorate. And that is more persuasive, I think, as an argument than the inability or the underperformance of wealthy millionaires who were running for office but weren't able to get it off the ground from their hundreds of millions of dollars. And the last thing I just say, in reflecting on the French perspective, is America has a wild, seemingly bewildering system of nominating its president. It is, on the one hand, problematic in a deeply polarized environment in which you find the left and right pandering to their respective bases during the course of an election cycle. But on the other hand, it is an inspiring, sort of original republic under, initial cap R, Republican story of how this federalist system came together in a way that wanted to empower the states. Now, it would be more pragmatic for regions to vote, as opposed to moving from Iowa to New Hampshire to South Carolina to Nevada. But fundamentally, I think it's an inspiring model insofar as it combines the will and brings together a collective will of American voters. It is, in some ways, unhelpful to have the first two contests be so disproportionately white and under or unrepresentative of the electorate as a whole. And I'm not saying it has to be a majority-minority state or constituency, but have some diversity and exemplify some pluralism of the American experience. But I would just say that, in the same way the Electoral College is designed, I think since you mentioned Bush v. Gore in the 2000 recount, which stunned a lot of people, and the fact that you couldn't assess who won, I find that more problematic when we talk about young people, and we might get to the subject of the youth vote and whether you all are going to vote in the primary or caucus in the states that you're from. But what I think is more problematic is the polarization of the political red and blue, which provides great disincentive among young people to vote in states like California and New York. And it would appear that if a candidate like Trump is able to attract a multiplicity of supporters among left and right, Democrats and Republicans, and I'm not denying the possibility too. I think Secretary Clinton came out of a period of negative, unfavorable coverage and is going to be a very formidable candidate in the general election. And I think that, interestingly, the Trump phenomenon is going to create crossover appeal for her, maybe just as much as it is for him, because the people who are voting for him are interested in a personality-driven, arguably totalitarian model of leader who's going to force compromise down the throats of the American people, right? And say anything xenophobic, racist, or whatever that he has to do in order to win a Republican primary. But the Clinton folks are potentially going to be empowered by crossover support who care more about the idea of having a public servant who doesn't represent the will of a billionaire or a mogul class. And interestingly, Senator, again, this is all really fascinating. You can say that interestingly after every sentence with this election because it's truly unprecedented. But Senator Sanders, when we look at this retrospectively, might have been great preparation for Hillary Clinton to make a winning argument against the billionaire mogul who seemingly hijacked our political process. And so I would just say, finally, that I find the polarization problematic in the context of the primaries, but I find it more problematic in the general election. But a Trump and Clinton race may prove to provoke voters in homogeneously red and blue states in a way that you wouldn't expect.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's an interesting point. When we think about the financing of elections across Europe, though, we have vastly different models compared to the United States. So, Joseph, you mentioned the fact that, checking the box for $3 to donate towards, a political campaign, the public financing of elections. We have public financing of elections in the United States, as all of you should know now. That doesn't necessarily mean our candidates use them. So why is it more acceptable practice, or should I say, why is it required in France that, candidates have some sort of public financing?
Have you ever read The Little Prince by the French novelist Antoine de Saint-Exupéry? It's in another planet, and the way they live in this planet is very different from this one. And I'll speak about this planet very far from the American planet.
Okay.
In our system, we consider that elections should be polarized on the question of equity between the different parties or between the different candidates, and that it's necessary to limit the expenses to a reasonable level. And it has a lot of implications, for instance, on campaigning tools. Maybe we'll speak about it later. About the access to the audiovisual media, another problem. But now I would like to say a few words about financing. About financing, there is a real gap between the philosophies in our two countries. In yours, the political philosophy have been defined in 2010 by the Supreme Court. I'm referring to the Citizen United against Federal Election Commission judgment. And your court considered that spending money in politics, in elections, was an extension of the liberty of expression, which is protected by the First Amendment. So it means that money in politics is considered as a means of freedom. As a consequence, the framework and the limit of using money in politics are very generous. In most European countries, including mine, money in politics is mostly considered on two other points of view. First, it's a danger for the equality of means between the different candidates of the different parties. And in second, a risk of corruption. You put the dominant accent on liberty, we put the dominant accent on equity, and in second, on ethics. And this explains a very different system. After many scandals that happened at the end of the 80s and the beginning of the 90s, we adopted a very strict legislation. It's strict, it's not always applied 100%, but I'll present the main aspects. First, legal entities, private or public, as companies or foundations, are not allowed to finance campaigns nor parties, not a dollar. Why? Because it would be considered as misappropriation of social funds. And in second, it's the same reasoning as Sanders. If you accept funds from lobbies, you may not be absolutely independent from them. Second consideration, as in this country, individual donations to a candidate are limited to around $5,000 per individual. It means, let's take the example of Mr. Trump. Mr. Trump, if he was candidate in France, would be allowed to put $5,000 to ask his wife, his ex-wife, the ex-wife, and so on, to put $5,000. He would not be allowed to put a single dollar of the companies or foundations that he is controlling. The money is coming for elections, partly from the states, who reimburse considering the number of voices that you reached, partly for the parties, but the parties are not allowed to receive money from legal entities. The party receive money only from the members, for the parliament members and so on, and from individual donation. And we have a level of maximum expenses fixed for each type of elections. Let's concentrate on the presidential one. I will quote only the figures of 2012 because they are the last for you and for us. In 2012, it will be changed very little because it will be we will just add the inflation on this. A candidate, I'm not sure that if I say that we have two round election. And at the second round, you just have the two candidates who had the best results at the first one. For a candidate who running for the first round, he is allowed to spend $18 million. $18 million. That's more or less what Jeb Bush spent in Iowa for the results that we know. And
Did everyone hear that?
and a
Can you say it again in terms of the amount?
I say that for a candidate who ran for the first turn and doesn't reach the second one, he is allowed to spend $18 million.
18 million in a French election.
And for a candidate running for the two turns, for the finalists, they are allowed to spend $24 million in total, each of them. So you should compare with the situation. I did a little calculation. In 2012, your two main candidates spent for the popular vote around roughly $1 billion. Of course, you cannot compare $1 billion with $24 million because your population, your electoral population is 5 times bigger than ours. But if you make the calculation per elector registered, when a candidate like Obama, for instance, spend $100, a French candidate is not allowed to spend more than $11. This is the rate per registered election. And so it makes an enormous difference. This is, and there is a control and so on, we could discuss this point. But this is linked also to the access to the media. Because as I saw here, you have people who spend millions of dollars to buy advertising, and you have candidates who gave to the media an immediate audience. They assured them success if they were invited on this TV and radio show. It's, of course, obviously the case of Mr. Trump. But Mr. Trump don't spend money for advertising. He doesn't need. He's his own advertising. But what complicated the system compared to yours is that we have in France an organization whose name is Superior Council of Audiovisual Sector, who is more or less the equivalent of your FCC. I have been member of this body, administered body, for 6 years. And one of its role, is to assure rules of pluralism and of honesty of information. And when you consider the problem of access to the media, the CSA, this body, has enact rules that are applied by the whole audiovisual sector, private as public, the TV networks as the radio, and they have general rules of honesty of information, of pluralism. It's very complicated, we'll not enter in this. But if we consider the electoral periods, the rule is very simple to define, not to apply. all the media, the TV and radio, it's not concerning the online media, of course. The TV and the radio must treat the different candidates on a basis of equity. Equity means taking into consideration the party they represent, the voices they had, the position in the polls, and so on.
So thinking about equity here, so,
Yes.
so thinking about in terms of equity in media, then there's a very kind of different, let's kind of focus and shift into the media system and thinking about how the media system, in terms of giving free media to candidates, might encourage certain types of behaviors. So when we think about, for example, Alexander, when we think about earned media, how important has earned media been in terms of kind of thinking about the confluence of free media and fundraising in this for a candidate like Bernie Sanders or a candidate like Donald Trump?
Well, first, I can't help but experience some catharsis from my good friend to my left here in appreciating, underscoring the significant difference in our media environment. And I like to expound on that because as someone who represents the public airwaves, as a host of a nationally syndicated show on PBS, I very much am sympathetic with the argument that you make for the American media experience, which is to encourage an organization like the FCC to incorporate equity into its understanding of how we need to regulate. But I do wonder in this classroom how many folks sitting here heard what you said and said, well, that's socialism, that's not democracy. Because how many of you, out of curiosity, I hope this might engender some dialogue, heard what he said about the media and said, well, that's not our way of operating? I can't say that's a majority, but a plurality maybe. I think, and that's a point of view in this country, that, like you said, liberty trumps everything. And liberty manifestly is dollars and cents. And speech has been redefined in this country as to include vast sums of wealth that are funneled into the contemporary media. And as the consolidation of the mainstream press has eliminated the mom and pops of radio and television into these huge conglomerates, it's something that has created an environment where the attention is placed on what drives ratings. Whether you want to call that earned or not, depends on the context. But I think that really the vast majority of American media programming has fundamentally, an imperative, and that imperative is eyeballs and clicks. And so that is a destructive force in thinking of where you're placing the priority on liberty. And if money is speech, then ultimately the capitalistic instinct is going to drive away the democratization of our economy, the democratization of the internet, if you think about the digital divide that exists in this country. And there is just not an entity alive, whether it's public, private, foundation, commission, that performs the function that you described of the board that you sat on. And there was an FCC that took a more active role in public life and in our media scene. But that was decades ago. You look like you have a thought, and I want to hear what it is.
No. Pardon?
You look like you have a thought.
No, it was an answer
Yeah.
more than a thought. is it socialism or not? It's bureaucracy. It's democratic bureaucracy, adaptly. But it's protective for candidates or for parties,
Right.
for everywhere, right and left.
No, I understand, and that's the irony of the
yeah.
the American refusal to accept that creating a bureaucracy is not socialistic inherently.
But let's consider that the fact that in 6, 8, 10 candidates, one of them is a mogul of reality TV. He is a star before becoming. You are used to see him in on your TV since years. He is popular before the first beginning of before the first minutes. He has got, by construction, an advantage.
Right.
So, if the system, the corporate system like the CSR, doesn't put a rule that put everybody on the same line, he has a chance. It's not mechanical, but he has a chance to keep its advantage, even if his own party is absolutely afraid of his position. I will go far in socialism. Not only we have a rule of equity, but at the very end of the campaign, it's no more equity, it's strict equality. It means there are still 10 candidates running, there are still 2 weeks. In the final 2 weeks before the first round, the radio and the TV, if they give 20 minutes on prime time to Mr. X with a probable next president, is obliged to give 20 minutes in prime time to Mrs. W, who will reach 5% in final. But the rule is equality. Of course, you can imagine that the TV networks doesn't like this rule because it's killing audience. Not when you have Mr. X, but when you have Mrs. W. This rule of strict equality, I don't say that it's a good system, but it's a protective one.
Well, and to put this in the context of American communications, we devised a system decades ago called the Fairness Doctrine that was attempting to do what you described, but it was gradually abolished, and those efforts of those attempts to get equal time during this cycle have been pretty much laughed at by most in the political and media establishment. And again, to compound that, you have a candidate, like you're saying, who has a hold on the media. You could buy a certain amount of media attention. You can't buy celebrity. For example, if Michael Bloomberg, another communications leader, were to get in the race, he wouldn't have that same advantage because he didn't appear on a primetime television show and develop a relationship with the viewer that leads the viewer to believe that what happened in the boardroom of Trump Tower is a simulation of what the Situation Room is like in the White House. And I think a lot of us would agree that the Situation Room in the White House is very different from the faux executive decision making that you saw, much more akin to a Judge Judy than to 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue.